Hi guys, I'm Megan Sin. Hope everybody's having a good spring break so far. If nothing else, at least we've got some good weather, at least for today anyway. Alright, so I've struggled deciding on which chapter to choose to do my presentation on, as old Joel Springs got a lot of interesting and thought-provoking ideas throughout the entirety of the book, which I also found to be incredibly clear, concise, and authoritative. So obviously I enjoyed our reading thus far this semester, but I ultimately decided to go with my review on Springs Chapter 1 in American Education, which is the history and political goals of public schooling. I chose it mostly because I thought in his first chapter he did a really good job of setting up the rest of the book, and you get little pieces of what he goes on to elaborate on in future chapters. I thought his take on issues discussed in the chapter were interesting, and most importantly, they were very thought-provoking. It's also very important to understand history of education and all that comes along with that. I did some further reading and found that Spring has a vision for a new kind of education, one that is judged on its contribution to one's sense of personal satisfaction, well-being, and longevity. Spring and some other reading critiques Becker's human capital model of education, which as far as human capital theory, the reason to invest in education is to spur economic growth. So, in other words, a global capitalistic economy, the goal of education is to prepare people to enter consumerism to make happy shoppers, per Joel Spring. So, he also quotes Becker's 1964 book, Human Capital, where Becker goes to say, an economy like that of the United States is called a capitalist economy, but the more accurate term is human capital or knowledge capital economy. So Joel Spring goes on to say, which we'll discuss more later in the PowerPoint, but he goes on to say, we went from producing goods to delivering services, financial and otherwise. So according to Spring, education was not always thus. It used to be focused on ethics, morality, truth, justice, the good society, social control, imperialism, and religion. In other words, education used to be about preparing people to get along with others or rule the rest with whom we could not get along. So, Spring thinks that it's now more so about proving our worth. So, we'll discuss that more throughout the presentation. So as far as the slideshow will go, I'll discuss the purposes of public school, as far as the goals of public schools, problems of defining content, tensions between parental rights, religious, cultural, political, social, or economical, the political purposes of school. We'll discuss education of future citizens and political leaders, the roles of mediocrity in the preparation of citizens and leaders, common schooling and problems with common education for all, the social purposes of schooling, the roles of schools in internal social control, the relationship between schooling and poverty, conflicts over whose goals and values should be represented, the economic purposes of schooling, the role of schools in socializing students for the workplace, the roles of schools in sorting students for the workplace. Then, as far as economic purposes of schooling in the global economy, we'll discuss the roles of schools in the global economy, economic benefits of education in the global economy, world-class standards in U.S. education, human capital and the role of business in American education. So, human capital in a global economy, the role of business in education, the conflicting interests of school and business, and then as far as further into human capital, regarding human capital and curriculum, which Spring discusses in regards to Common Core in this chapter, human capital and inequality of educational opportunity, and the impact of education inflation and economic opportunities. So we can go ahead and go to the slideshow. All right, so in the first part of Chapter 1, Spring discusses Common Core standards in regards to the protected or the prepared childhood and whether or not the primary goal of schooling should be for preparation for work and college. And then he goes on to consider the traditional goals of public schooling. And some of the traditional goals of education that he discusses are democratic government participation, schooling in order to reduce crime, and enrich cultural thoughts, to educate through sexual education, interpersonal and social education, alcohol and drug abuse education, and enrichment through the arts and education. All right, so in my browsing through JSTOR, I came across an article in Economic and Political Weekly by Krishna Kumar, and it's titled Childhood in a Globalizing World. And it's really interesting perspective when you think about when Joel Spring's talking about the protected or prepared childhood, and she gives some interesting insights. So Kumar goes on to say that within the bounded world in which children were supposed to develop their potential for learning, trained teachers organized meaningful experiences in the form of activities with which the child could engage. So they regulated the pace and nature of the child's interaction with the outside world, the immediate home environment. As a modern institution, the school placed the child in a professionally managed world which offered meaningful experience and filtered out or countered experiences which were not conducive to the child's development. Teachers received specialized training to ensure that they appreciated the child's need for a pedagogical and morally sound curriculum. In this role, the teacher was assisted by the other specialists who designed the curriculum in a manner that would ensure the child's encounter with knowledge was in keeping with the child's capacity to cope with knowledge and to internalize it. In what is known as the progressive movement in educational theory, the immediate milieu of the child had a special status as a resource for learning. Dewey treated the milieu as one of the four commonplaces of curriculum, emphasizing the role it would play in socializing the child into a structure of activities and relationships characteristic of the community. All right, Spring suggests that the schools reflect the concept of the protected childhood by providing opportunities to play, be healthy, use imagination, and be happy. Educational practices that traditionally reflect protected childhood include things such as recess, gym, personal development for a happy life, education for enjoyment of arts, and healthcare and instruction. So, in American Education, Spring says that preparation for work or college, as reflected in the Common Core standards and its accompanying emphasis on test preparation, impact many of the practices associated with protected childhood, including reduction in recess time, classroom instruction emphasizing test preparation in contrast to student interest and intellectual enjoyment, kindergarten as preparation for first grade, in contrast to time for social and imaginative development, and reduction of arts programs and reduction of extracurricular activities. The idea that education's purpose is for economic growth and competition is not a new one. In the last 100 years, nearly all educational philosophy and changes to the American education system were attempts to better prepare students for entering the workforce. Politicians and school leaders justify this reasoning as necessary for economic development. According to scholar Joel Spring, human capital theory, contends that investment in education will provide the quality of workers and, consequently, increase the wealth of the community. So, in June of 2010, the NGA Center and the CCSSO released a set of state-led education standards known as Common Core State Standards, and as with most changes and reform to educational system, controversy, of course, ensued. So those against the Common Core claim these standards have turned education into a data-driven corporation that seeks only conformity and standardization that hinders academic freedom, educators' autonomy, experimentation, innovation, and creativity. And after reading the mission statement for the Common Core, it's hard to argue against these assumptions, as even their mission statement standards are reflective of the knowledge and skills that our young people need for college and careers. And with Americans fully prepared for the future, our communities will be best positioned to compete successfully in the global economy. And that comes from the Common Core State Standards website and from their mission statement. So it seems as though a lot of people think that by selling out our education system to private corporations and industries in the pursuit of federal tax dollars, government legislation has failed its teachers, students, and nation. So the purpose of education is to give students the skills, technological abilities, and knowledge to contribute to their future workplace, but lots of people also feel that it's also important for them to include the tools to function, contribute intellectually within a community and society, which sometimes is missing from the Common Core. All right, so Spring goes on to discuss an example of how the goal of preparation for work or college affects the actual content of the Common Core standards and how it can be found in the area of literacy instruction. The goal of preparation increases the reading of nonfiction and decreases the reading of fiction. Eliminated from the standards are goals of related student feelings to a reading selection or writing about their feelings. The goal is learning to read and write for work or a college course. There are so many other skills educators are capable of teaching. For example, character education, communication, critical thinking, conflict resolution, community service, ethics, racial and gender discrimination, and equality, all of which ought to be commonplace in our education system. But a lot of people feel that as though for content purposes, educators are made to load and overwhelm the student's mind with knowledge of math, science, and history, but fail to provide them with the tools to develop their emotional and psychological abilities. Since the implementation of Common Core, lots of teachers argue that they are not permitted to develop and administer their own assessments as they've become mandated and generic. Lesson plans and employed materials are common to all teachers in a given subject area and restrict critical thinking and creativity with their one-size-fits-all setup. In education, there is no one-size-fits-all. It's impossible. And during my research, I found an essay regarding the pitfalls of Common Core by McPartland and Schneider. And they say, analysis of the organizational difficulties of addressing the diversity of students in mass public education can highlight the impediments of the new learning standards. As differentiation is necessary in education and hard in regards to the implementation. So Spring goes on to discuss the major political goals of American schools, which include teaching a common set of political beliefs, learning to obey the law by obeying school rules, providing an equal opportunity for all to be elected to political positions, emphasizing voting as the key to political and social change, learning about the workings of government, educating patriotic citizens, and educating students to be involved in community activities. So it's obvious that politics are a driving force in the goals of schooling. And Spring uses a quote from the 2008 Republican platform when they declared that it is through education that we ensure the transmission of culture, a set of values we hold in common. It has prepared generations for responsible citizenship and a free society, and it must continue to do so. So, besides educating political leadership, schools were called on to educate future citizens. Spring goes on to quote and talk about how citizens were to receive their political education from reading newspapers published under laws protecting freedom of the press. Citizens would choose between competing political ideas found in newspapers. So, for Jefferson, the most important political functions of schools was teaching reading. While people obtain their news differently these days. We have the internet, we have YouTube, we have TV. So, but it's still really important to think about where your sources are coming from and whether or not they're politically driven. So I guess it's important to remember that there is a strong tradition of dissent to the public schools teaching any political doctrines, and that some argue that teaching political ideas is a method of maintaining the political power of those whom are in control of the government. So, as far as politics and education in American schools, there are lots of controversies surrounding the content. But after reading Spring's chapter on the history and political goals of public schooling, while he had very insightful and thought provoking ideas, there are still lots of questions to think about. Well, that was definitely the most editing I've ever done in my life. I'm sure most of you had similar experiences. I hope I did, however, run into some technical glitches, so I hope that they aren't too annoying and or distracting for you. But thanks for watching either way. Hope everybody has a great spring break. Thanks.